something pop up on your screen. The I-STARR project is supported by a grant from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. It's part of the larger NIH Helping to End Addiction Long-Term, or the HEAL initiative, and it's one of several projects that comprise the Consortium on Addiction Recovery Science, or the COARS network. So this webinar today is the 5th webinar in the I-STARR training series, and it's the 4th training that's geared towards folks who operate or provide recovery housing. So what does that mean? It basically means that we've developed webinars with specific information about operating recovery housing that may be particularly useful for folks who own, operate, manage, or otherwise assist in the day-to-day or week-to-week functioning of a recovery residence, whether that be as a CEO of a large recovery housing organization or a senior resident with governance and management responsibilities. We also encourage folks who are unfamiliar with recovery residences or the activities that recovery residence operators engage in to attend these webinars to get a better sense of what operators do and what residents receive while they're living in recovery housing. So that is the I-STARR training series. Why don't we go to the next slide? This is the I-STARR team. I'm Dr. Amy Miracle. I'm a research scientist in the Alcohol Research Group at the Public Health Institute. I co-lead the I-STARR project with Dr. Carmen Masson, who's a professor of psychiatry in the School of Medicine at UCSF. The team also includes co-investigators Sarah Zemore and Lenny Jason, biostatisticians Mina Subaraman and Lebo Lee, and communication specialists Diane Schmidt and Dustin Kebsu. Our project coordinator is Quinosia Capitani. Next slide, please. The I-STARR project activities are also guided by a 17-member advisory board comprised of a diverse group of leaders from across the country. And while most advisory board members wear multiple hats, collectively they represent recovery and recovery housing leaders, treatment providers and payers, national policy advocates, as well as researchers and educators. Some of our advisory board members may be in our audience today, and it always, just makes me so pleased to share that some of our board members will also serve as presenters in this webinar series. Next slide, please. So we have 3 different presenters for this webinar, 3 superstars in the recovery housing field. These are Joel Bagley, Beth Fisher-Sanders, and George Brott. The gang is back. If you've been at our other webinars, we have that George, Beth, and Joel back again. So Joel currently serves as on the board of the National Alliance for Recovery Residences, or NAR, and co-chairs the Affiliates Committee, which provides technical assistance and guidance to emerging state-level affiliate organizations. So Joel's experience with recovery began with his teenage son entering addiction treatment in 1996. The recovery experience was so transformative for their entire family that Joel left his corporate career in communications and became a certified addictions counselor. In 2003, Joel and his son opened a level 3 recovery residence called Purple Inc. in Atlanta, Georgia. Joel and Purple Inc. sought the help of the Georgia Association of Recovery Residences, or GAR, to help ensure that Purple would always operate as a certified quality recovery residence. Joel served as the president of GAR from 2007 to 2009 and was instrumental in the formation of NAR in 2011. So that's a little bit about Joel. We'll also be hearing from Beth Fisher-Sanders, and her experience is equally impressive. Beth is a writer, trainer, mentor, and advocate for ethical standards-based recovery housing, recovery support services, and community building. Beth began her career in 1988 as a counselor in a women's recovery residence. Her experience there and her own recovery journey has guided her mission and vision ever since. She's worked in all areas of the recovery continuum as a peer, as a clinician, and as a supervisor. In 1996, Beth founded Hope Recovery Resources, and in 2011, Beth facilitated a bunch of like-minded leaders from across the country to organize and form the National Alliance for Recovery Residents and served as its founding president. Beth continues to serve as the NAR serve NAR as the chair of the Standards Committee, and she also serves on boards of several state affiliates of NAR. And last but not least, we'll also hear from George Brott. George's over 14,000 hours of psychotherapy, supervision, and applied community psychology experience is focused on professional and peer workforce development that emphasizes continuous service quality and program outcome improvement. In the realm of peer services, George co-founded the Certified Addictions Recovery Empowerment Specialists, or CARES Academy, a peer recovery coach training that is operational in several states, as well as the Forensic Peer Mentor Ready for Reentry training. George is a level 2 trainer in the Partners for Change Outcome Management Program, a charter board member of the National Alliance for Recovery Residences, and a recovery consultant with SAMHSA's Opioid Response Network. And with those introductions, I am pleased to hand things off to our amazing presenters to share information on the topic of recovery residences, standards, and fiscal management. Next slide, please.
All right, so glad everyone is here. We'd like to start off by just asking you several questions, and you'll see the poll pop up on your screen. If you would, just take your mouse or use your finger if you have a touch screen to answer these. First one is, whose are you? And you can select all that apply. Are you a recovery residence operator, owner, or staff person? Are you a recovery resident? Are you a certified or licensed clinician, a researcher, academic, other, or maybe you're none of the above? And then secondly, is there a National Alliance for Recovery Residences affiliate in your state? And your answer choices are yes, and I'm involved with it and other recovery residence operators, or yes, but I'm not involved yet, or no. So if you would, just click on those 2 poll questions, and after you've answered both questions, hit that submit button, just so we can find out a little bit about who's with us today. Our survey says, all right, so biggest group or researchers or academics, followed by other. That'd be interesting to know who the 38% others are. We've got about a third that are recovery residence operators, owners, and staff. We've got some folks who are actually recovery residents, and about a quarter of the group is a certified or licensed clinician. Nice. And then for the second question, 42% are involved with their National Alliance for Recovery Residence affiliate. About a third, not yet. And then 8% no. And then 21% don't know if they are, if there's a NAR affiliate in their state. Well, we're gonna provide you with some important answers to those questions today. Thank you. Next slide, please.
All right, so let's talk about the objectives in our short time together, because any one of these things, laws, standards, or ethics, is easily a whole day of a presentation in itself. So our objective is really overriding in all of these that we've done to date, and that is to pique your interest in these topics, because we want to point you to the resources so that you can learn about these issues that are so important to recovery residences. And I can't think of anything more important than these 3 topics, law, standards, and ethics, for how we do things and why we do things. So objective is it really, why should I care? Ultimately, that's what we're getting at in number 1. How does this apply to me if I'm an operator or a recovery residence operator that I interface with? And then what are the specific laws that apply to recovery residences? What are the standards and ethics that are relevant to consider and important? And number three, how do I begin to make ethical decisions regarding recovery residences, or consider what those ethical decision-making processes are? And the method we will teach you very briefly is a method that you can apply to really all ethical decision-making. So that's what we hope to set out to do today. Next slide, please. So then when we talk about laws, standards, and ethics, I think we can get on board right away that these are important for recovery residences, but there's only one that is truly externally imposed, and that's laws. So it's important to understand those laws, because for any of these three, there's no excuse for not being aware. If we are an operator or we work with a recovery residence in any way, not knowing about these three issues it just doesn't fly anywhere, whether it's with a court of law or your affiliate provider, or just doing the right thing, ethics. So we want to be knowledgeable about the issues. So what are the laws imposed by the industry? Well, quite simply, things like fair housing law, employment laws, licensing issues, patient brokering. Okay. And then for standards, things to consider are certainly the fiscal responsibility notated, but also general operating. What are a baseline of standards? And some of that we have covered or touched on in previous webinars, such as policy and procedures. We did a fair amount of pointing to standards there. Ethical operations. What are the best practices that are not imposed by an outside source? What is doing the right thing? What is the right thing for recovery residence operators? Doing the right thing for the right reasons is what I think of as ethics distilled. Next slide, please.
So when we talk about laws that affect recovery residences, and I'm going to say we're just going to focus on those that are specific to recovery residents, because all the other laws that affect operating a business apply to you as well, as Beth already mentioned. Things like laws having to do with your being an employer. So but when it comes to recovery residence laws, the ones that we hear about the most, and I'm sure most of you have heard of these and in cases, and it has to do with typically when some municipality or even a neighborhood association is trying to impose that you can't be here. We don't want you in our backyard. And so and we could spend all afternoon on this, but the quick overview and how these laws relate, I'm just going to take you through pretty quickly. And I'll mention right now, in the resources part of this presentation, there are links to 3 excellent documents there. One on the Americans with Disability Act that tells you exactly why people in recovery or in a recovery residence are covered under that act. There's also an easy to read document on the Federal Fair Housing Act and how that and the American with Disabilities Acts are connected together. And then there's also a paper on the Oxford House versus City of Edmonds, which is a legal document and it reads like one, but it really tells you what happened in that case many years ago that has set the precedent for how it has been applied to all recovery residents. First off, American Disabilities Act, if you're in recovery from any kind of illicit drug, or you suffer under alcohol use, whether you're in recovery or not, though you are then considered as a person who is disabled under the American with Disabilities Act. So that's the simple reason why recovery residences fall under that. The Federal Fair Housing Act then follows that and says when it comes to housing, you can't discriminate against any protected class under the Americans with and the Americans with Disabilities is a particular class that's mentioned there. So that brings us, as recovery residents, the residents themselves are protected under the Federal Fair Housing Act. Now, there are many ways that municipalities try to get around it by redefining what they think is family. And usually the most common thing is that they'll specify a limit to the number of unrelated people living together. And usually that limit, a lot of times that limit's 4 or something like that. And so that's where the municipalities come in violation of the Federal Fair Housing Act. And for us as recovery residence operators, the thing that we need to know is that under the Federal Fair Housing Act, we can ask for reasonable accommodation. And those are 2 very important words to remember. That's always what you're looking for. And if they don't, so you ask for reasonable accommodation. And if that's denied or ignored, then that's where you have the grounds to take it further legally if necessary. But I will tell you from an individual who's had to deal with municipalities and their regulations, usually if, in my experience, if you try to approach this in a, hey, we're trying to do something good in our community, just like you are. So how do we work together? You can usually get a lot farther with that than coming right off the bat and threatening some lawsuit. That puts everybody in opposite corners, and then it puts you on the spot to like, oh, now what do? I don't have enough money to go hire a lawyer and all that. But sometimes those lawsuits are necessary, and that's where the Oxford House versus City of Edmonds comes in. That was one of the earliest cases. It went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the Supreme Court founded for Oxford House that the City of Edmonds was in fact in violation of the Federal Fair Housing Act. And they go into a lot of detail of why they were. So if you want to get a quick education, read those 3 documents that are referenced in these resources, and that'll tell you everything you know to be at least you'll know 90% more than everybody else if you've just read those 3 documents. And then if you really if you run into a situation and you need some help, then that's where you need to go find a good lawyer who understands the Federal Fair Housing Act. All right, next slide. Oh, I'm sorry.
Can I jump in too with a couple other points, because I think that functionally equivalent family idea that was proven out in court also ties into what we've talked about previously regarding social model, which is how we use community intentionally in our recovery residence. That community is family. It functions like a family. So things that we've talked about, like how we set up the home, all of that in a family style way, it's all relevant here, and it ties into this, and we have the law behind us to support it. The other thing I didn't want to gloss over too much or go over too much, but we do need to note it, I think, is the gray areas of law. just to call out things, other considerations that we can't get into here, but fall under this, such as landlord-tenant law and licensing of recovery residents, which we touched on in levels, the obvious business things like taxes, and MOUD considerations too for capable residences. So those are gray areas for law, but they're there.
All right, next slide. Thank you, Beth.
All right, so the second consideration is standard best practices. What is a common denominator of accepted practices for operating a recovery residence? Well, the National Alliance for Recovery Residences, which has affiliates in excess of 35 states, enacts 4 domains for practice, and those domains we have also covered some in previous webinars. And the first is administrative operations, how we develop our policies and procedures, and how we demonstrate things like fiscal transparency, that going into a recovery residence, the resident knows exactly what they are obligated to financially. It's on paper in front of them. That's a baseline best practice. And then our business practices overall are transparent. So that domain of operation is critical. And I do want to call out that policy and procedure webinar that went over a lot of these administrative operations in great detail. Insurance is another consideration under administrative. Physical environment, webinar number 2, where how we set up our residents in home-like environments in ways that build that community and family feel. That is a standard for best practices, so that it's not institutional and it is a home for those we serve. And then number 3, what happens in the home, how we create a recovery conducive environment, and what kinds of support services happen in the home, like employment. How do we help our residents secure employment? How do we help them plug in with the greater community to find things that are going to build recovery skills, recovery capital, if you will, meetings, sponsorship, therapies, health concerns? How do we help them get there? And then the 4th domain is really about how the recovery residence interfaces with that greater neighborhood, the community at large. Are we good neighbors to those that we are literally living next door to? So that happens not just at the operator level, but it happens at the resident level too, because indeed it is a life skill. And so how we create that environment to implement these 4 domains is a part of best practice standards. I like to think of them as the gold standard, the good housekeeping seal of approval. So if you have questions about how to get that seal of approval, well, that happens through a NAR affiliate. I encourage you to reach out if you have not connected. Next slide, please.
Well, so the last element we want to discuss today has to do with ethics, and particularly how those get applied within recovery residences. Next slide. So you have in your list of resources the NAR Code of Ethics, and we're not going to go over each of the items on that code, but I do want to point out that the last page of it is what is particularly important with regards to what any operator and staff should be aware of, and in fact sign, saying that they understand this code of ethics and agree to follow them to the best of their ability. And I think it is not necessarily a bad idea sometimes to even have residents complete this, because it's a standard that can apply across different groups. And again, we're not gonna dig into this in a lot of detail, but just wanted to point that element out as part of what's in the NAR Code of Ethics. Next slide, please. So we're also proposing a 4-step ethical decision-making protocol. And this is something that actually I adapted and borrowed from William White, for those of you who may be familiar with Bill's work. But step 1 is to identify what's the potential risk level, who and to what extent are different folks at risk. And it runs from the person being served all the way through to the community in which the recovery residence sits. And it's a way of having a conversation around what are our ideas going into addressing this challenge about risk level and who's at potential risk. Step 2 asks, what are the core recovery values that might apply to this situation? There's a list of them in this document. I suggest if you have an organization that has its own set of values, that you plug those in here. And the key question is, so what action do those values suggest that you check as being relevant to this situation? And based on that, step 3 is to look at the laws, organizational policies, ethics codes, standards, and the historical practice that might influence your behavior in this situation. So we all know we've gone to work with organizations, and one of the first things they do first day is hand you a big thick book and say, here's the policies and procedures, go read this. And that's great. And then you hang out at the coffee pot or in the kitchen or wherever, and you learn about this is how we really do things around here. And so it's a way of helping to organize all this information. And by the way, a lot of recovery residences provide peer support as well as clinical services. Fundamentally, what that means is you typically have different codes of ethics that get applied to different professional groups. And it's important for people to be able to have the knowledge about this is how we do things around here, even though we may actually be following different codes of ethics. But having that discussion is an important part of how we begin to develop our way of responding to ethical challenges. And then step 4 is simply to document. This is what this is who I talk to. This is what I decided to do, or the options that I considered, and then what I decided to do. And then lastly, it's really important to document and what happened. What was the result? And I'm suggesting this as a way of having a conversation among staff people and potentially residents in a recovery residence. And if you take these documents and put them together in a manual, you will have what I call a catalog of organizational practices and ethics, or a COPE. And the COPE is a way of, instead of just handing folks a policy and procedures manual when they come on the board or when they're hired, you hand them the COPE and you actually say, this is how we do things around here, and this is why. So it helps to flesh out, put some meat on the bones of what can sometimes seem like real odd policies and procedures. But that's the 4-step ethical decision-making process.
George, can I share an example
Please.
of an ethical challenge where I was able to utilize some of these steps? It was really early on in operating Hope, my recovery residences, and I had this series of calls from folks offering me money for residence. And I knew that didn't sound right. There wasn't an ethics code for recovery residences at that point. I was familiar with some others, but my first inclination was this doesn't feel right. And so for step one, the risk was I didn't know, and not knowing was a risk in that moment. And that's the thing too with ethics, isn't it? That I would say most of the ethical missteps are made not by bad players, though that it is the bad players that have given the industry, recovery industry overall, a not so great name at times. But most of the ethical missteps are from not knowing.
Sure.
But this step 2 through 4 helps us with that not knowing by what's the value and what's the action that value would suggest. Well, the value that came to my mind was I'm trying to help people. How do I know that this person being offered up to me was appropriate for the help that I offer in my recovery residence? So that was the value. And then the ethics, the laws, well, sure enough, when I went to the affiliate, there was a name for that, right? And it was patient brokering or client brokering. And in fact, now, good news is that over the years, in recent years, there have been laws enacted for things like inducements, patient brokering, and that's a great thing. But really, at the highest level, it is an serious ethical violation when you accept an inducement, patient brokering. And then the documentation, for me, it was writing it out. What is actually happening here? And applying the previous steps to it. So I just had a flashback as you were going through about that incident. Other ethical concerns that we hear about are boundaries with residents, right? And the NAR ethics code at 20 ethics codes gets at a number of relationship boundaries that we can have with residents, because it does get gray, and that's where ethics happens, in the gray area. We are working with people and sometimes living with them if we're a senior resident or resident manager. That makes things really fuzzy when we work with people in their homes. So having a code around having those ethical good boundaries is important. And then the other ethics that came to mind is what we said earlier around transparency, that we are transparent in all of our operations. We don't have anything to hide.
Yeah. Well, and most of the time when ethical decisions are made, we make snap judgments. It's here's what I think is the right answer. And then we look around to see who agrees with us and who disagrees with us. And then we get into a debate over who's right. And the point really is that if that's all you do, you missed out on all the guidance that's available, because you don't often think, well, what does the code of ethics say? Or what does the organizational policy and procedures say we should do? It's just, this is my gut feeling. And if what you're arguing against is somebody else's gut feeling, the chances of changing that are slim to none, and slim left town.
Yeah. Yeah, and you talk about the responsibility ultimately, and the responsibility of I to we,
Yes.
and that really speaks to the heart of ethical decision making, doesn't it?
And social model as well.
Yeah, yeah, good.
So next slide.
All right. Well, we
Excellent.
have, yeah, that's it, Amy.
George, Beth, and Joel, you guys never cease to amaze me. You never disappoint. Excellent information and a really nice overview of these really important topics that we could spend a whole webinar, each one of them on. So thank you for giving this a high level overview. But to make sure that folks can understand these really important topics more thoroughly, we have compiled a list of resources. Next slide. We've broken them out into different laws, and there's also 45 CFR Part 2. We listed some resources for that, HIPAA laws, and then we dropped some links in for the ADA, the Fair Housing Act, some case law. Joel mentioned the Oxford House versus the City of Edmonds, and resources from NAR. I will drop into the chat the resources so you can point and click and navigate to 45 CFR Part 2 resources and HIPAA resources as well. Next slide, please. So given that we've given you guys a pretty high level overview, we wanted to make sure that we left time for questions that you may have on this topic, or on the topic of ethics, on laws, and on the standards. So please feel free to drop your questions into the chat, or you can also raise your hand within Zoom. We have these experts at our disposal right now, Beth, George, and Joel. So feel free to ask your questions. And I think I saw some questions in the chat as we were going.
Yeah.
Diane, were you keeping track of that?
So Beth, you might want to, one of the last ones that popped up, this is one that we hear often at NAR. There's a lot of preference to it, but the actual question is, what is NAR's stance on whether recovery residents can deny access for someone who is prescribed buprenorphine that they will need to take daily?
Right. So the short answer to what could be a long answer question is that there's only one reason that that individual could be denied access to the residence, and that is if the recovery residence is not equipped to serve that resident in a safe way. So NAR's actually developed best practices for serving MAT folks on MAT. And if that residence is unable to provide the safety measures needed, then yes, that instance is not a common instance though. So the short answer is that our standard is, the NAR standard states that that individual will be served.
So a related question that we got from Elliot, can you speak on how the ADA and the Fair Housing Act apply to the protection of residents and those referred to recovery residents who are prescribed Suboxone and buprenorphine?
And I'll just add to what Beth said, that I think you have an ethical responsibility as a recovery service provider to know who in your area you can refer people who are using MOUDs, if you don't accept those people into your program yourself. So it's not appropriate just saying, no, sorry, we can't serve you.
Or worse still, we don't believe in that.
Yes. Well,
So thank you. I appreciate it. I know this is complicated. So what are those safe, like, I appreciate that information. Where can I see information or find information on what you consider to be those safety measures? And how does that differ for someone who may, say, be a diabetic taking insulin?
So the MAT best practices, I'm not sure if it's a resource in this webinar, but it has been in previous webinars, or go to narronline.org and look for the MAT policy guide. I'm not sure of the exact title, but it'll be pretty apparent on the website.
Okay, thank you.
Good question.
It is a good question.
Beth, did you want to say anything about 45 CFR Part 2 or HIPAA? We do have resources that we can share on that.
Right. So those are laws that apply to clinical levels of care. They're confidentiality laws, meaning that we can't disclose who is in our facility and as a service provider there. And for the standard, the best practice standard, they are also part of the best practice. So to be a NAR certified provider, you would adhere to that as a best practice in a recovery residence. And that would be for level or type 1 through 3. If you're a type or level 4, you already have to do that because you're providing a clinical level of service.
And a little bit broader way of understanding this is if you receive either directly or indirectly federal funds, chances are 42 CFR and HIPAA will apply to your program.
Any other questions? Please feel free to continue to drop them into the chat, but we do have a number of announcements. And we want to make sure that people are kept up to speed on everything that's happening with I-STARR and the recovery housing community. So if we go to the next slide, that would be fantastic. Perfect. We'll be hosting another I-STARR webinar later this month, one that's specifically geared towards those who want to begin research on recovery housing. And this researcher webinar will focus on recruitment and tracking of marginally housed and legal system involved study participants. It will feature an overview of the topic by Betsy Hall at UCLA, who was the primary author on the Staying in Touch field manual, as well as examples from sober living house research presented by Liz Mahoney. So in November, the I-STARR training series will just have one webinar. It will be an all audience webinar, and that means it's for operators, researchers, policymakers, other stakeholders, and this will provide an overview of treatments and medications for opioid use disorder. It will be presented by Dr. Andy Tompkins, who's a professor of psychiatry in the School of Medicine at UCSF, and he's also the director of Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital's Division of Substance Use and Addiction Medicine. So the I-STARR webinars are always held on Tuesdays from 11 to 12 for folks on the West Coast, which is 2 to 3 for folks on the East Coast. The operator provider webinars, as well as the webinars that are germane to all stakeholders, our all audience webinars, are held on the first Tuesday of the month, and the researcher webinars are held on the third Tuesday of the month. And there's so much more happening this month, guys. So starting next week is the NAR Best Practices Summit, which will be held in Dearborn, Michigan. It's running from Monday to Wednesday. And it looks like Beth, Joel, and myself will be there, as well as lots of other folks who are presenting on and wanting to learn more about recovery housing. George, Beth, or Joel, is there anything that you guys want to say about the NAR Best Practices Summit or how folks can participate? And I can drop a link into the chat about where people can find out more information.
Well, I don't think you can register online anymore for it, but do consider yourself welcome and encouraged to come. This is a gathering of, it really does feel like a family reunion every year of like-minded individuals who believe in the things that we've been talking about here. And we do a much deeper dive on all of these topics, and as well as the networking opportunities with people from all across the country. It's just invaluable. It's very rewarding. It's exciting to be a part of. We'd love to see you there.
Wonderful. Thanks, Beth. And finally, before we leave this slide, I want to bring one more thing to your attention, and this is an opportunity to participate in a virtual focus group. As folks may know, in addition to trainings and webinars, the I-STARR project also supports research infrastructure by supporting pilot studies. And one of the I-STARR pilot studies is led by Rachel Winograd at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and she'll be developing and pilot testing a measure of barriers to MOUD in recovery housing that assesses stigma and capacity from the perspective of both operators and residents. And as part of the measurement development process, she wants to make sure that she hears from both operators and residents about what's important to know and to ask about when assessing MOUD stigma and being MOUD capable. And this is where folks here in this webinar may be able to help. Now I'm going to pass things off to Rachel's team. I think that we have someone, maybe Rashmi is here, to tell you more about the focus groups and how folks may be able to participate. Do we have someone from Rachel's team here?
Yeah, hi, my name is Rashmi. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. So I think Dr. Miracle did a really good job of summarizing what it is that we're looking for, but basically we're hoping to launch a national survey on the barriers towards medications for opiate use disorder in specifically recovery house settings. And we're hoping to launch that sometime in December, January-ish. And towards that end, we're trying to finalize some of the survey items. So we really want some feedback from people who work in the field, who deal with this sort of thing every single day. So that's where the two focus groups come in. So I put some information about how to sign up for them in the chat. And basically, if you know any recovery housing operators or recovery housing residents, or if you yourself are one, please feel free to drop your information in that form. That way we'd be able to contact you, reach out to you, and get the information we need to get the survey on the ground and running. And hopefully we can also reach back out to you when it comes time for our research for our survey to be launched, and then we can get some more participants that way as well.
Thank you, Rashmi, for sharing information on how folks can be involved in this measurement development process. And I have to say that I really like that that you guys are doing this extra work at the outset to make sure that we're consulting experts in the measurement development process, people who really know recovery housing. So I think that's fabulous. So we listed the dates on this slide. Do you guys have times set for the focus groups at this point, or do you just have windows? What can you tell us about when they actually will be held?
Right. So our focus groups, we're hoping to have them for about 2 hours each to maximize the amount of flexibility we'd have, because of course we're getting a lot of different people from all over the country. We'd hold these focus groups sometimes between 12 to 7 on October 12th or October 13th. That is up to people's availability and flexibility on those particular days. So don't feel bad at all if you're only available for like 2 or 3 hours on that specific like 12th, or 2 or 3 hours on the 13th. I'm sure we can try and find a way to accommodate you. So don't let that be a barrier to filling out this form and getting in contact with us.
Excellent. Thank you. Why don't we go to the next slide?
And Amy, just as a tag on to that, I did drop into the chat NAR's paper on recommended practices for MAT and recovery residents. So if anybody, we were talking about that a minute ago, and it relates to what you were just talking about there. There is a document there in the chat for that I've just put in a moment ago.
Perfect. Thank you, Jewel. Before we wrap up, guys, I want to talk to folks who are registered for the provider training series, as well as folks who might be considering registering for it. So as a reminder, this webinar is part of a series of 12 different webinars, and folks who attend all 12 webinars in the provider series will receive a certificate of completion, and provided the opportunity of being identified on the I-STARR website as a provider who has completed this training. You can also earn 12 NADAC CEUs, and those credits are given at the end of the training series. So if you're registered for the provider series, or if you're thinking about registering for it, we ask that at the end of this webinar, when you sign off, that you complete a brief evaluation, and that needs to be completed so we can track attendance, and this counts towards the NADAC CEU credits. And this evaluation will just basically pop up on your screen when you leave the webinar. And again, if you're not registered or you're curious about registering and you haven't yet, you can just go to the I-STARR webinar and register for the entire series that way in one quick click. We tried to make it easy for you guys. Now, if you have to miss a live webinar, we're building onto our platform, on our webpage, a platform so that folks can view the webinar series in a more interactive way. So we're hoping that folks who are registered for the series and miss one use this platform. It's a learning management system. You can ask questions of our presenters for the webinar. We'll be monitoring the chat. The attendance tracking is built in, so it's the evaluation. It's just a much easier and hopefully more interactive way for you guys to view the webinars and interact with the presenters if you're not able to be here live. But regardless of folks who are, registered for the full series or just kind of dropping in here or there, it's been an absolute delight to be partnering with NAR and the past few webinars. Huge thanks to Beth, Jewel, and George, who been really leading these webinars and making sure that we cover everything that we need to on these topics, that we have lists of resources for you guys, and it's just been it's really great to have them as a resource in this regard. So I think that's going to conclude the webinar, but if folks want to stay on a little bit longer, we can have folks from Rachel's pilot study, Rashmi, can stick around a little bit longer, so that if folks do want to participate or have questions about the webinar, or excuse me, the virtual focus group, we can answer those kinds of questions. And also, if folks, we do have a couple minutes, so if folks do have additional questions for the presenters, we can ask those now as well. Let me open my screen to see if I'm seeing hands. If not, feel free to log off. And like I said, we will stick around until the top of the hour to answer any questions about the webinar, as well as about the virtual focus groups.